Well, so whenever you encounter some sudden danger out there in the world, that the information from that stimulus, let's say it's I don't know, a snake on the path, will go into your brain through the visual system if it's a visual stimulus, and then will rise through the visual system through the standard pathways. So every sensory system has this very well organized set of circuits that ultimately leads to a stop in a part of the brain called the thalamus en route to reaching the sensory cortex. So each sensory system has an area in the cortex. The cortex is that wrinkled part of the brain that you see whenever you see a picture of the brain. And that's where we have our perceptions and thoughts and all of that. So in order to have a visual perception, information has to be transmitted from the eye, from the retina, through the optic nerve into the visual thalamus, and from the visual thalamus to the visual cortex, where the processing continues and you then ultimately have the perception. So the visual cortex connects directly with the amygdala. And so that's one route by which the information can get in. Retina, thalamus, cortex, amygdala. But one of the first things that I discovered when I started studying fear was that pathway, the usual pathway that we think about for sensory processing, was not the way that fear was elicited, or not the only way. What we found was that if the cortical pathway was blocked completely, rats could still form a memory about a sound. We were studying sounds and shocks, but we've also done it with visual stimuli. So what we found was that sound had to go up to the level of the thalamus, but then it didn't need to go to the auditory cortex or the visual cortex if it was a visual stimulus. Instead, it made an exit from the sensory system and went directly into the amygdala below the level of the cortex. That was really important because we generally think that the cortex is required for any kind of conscious experience. So this is a way that information was being sent through the brain and triggering emotions unconsciously. So the psychoanalysts loved this. Because it vindicated the idea that you could have this unconscious fear that the cortex has no understanding of. So the idea was elaborated a bit into this concept where it's possible that the cortical and the thalamic inputs to the amygdala could become dissociated in people for one reason or another, such that the stimuli that are triggering the amygdala from the thalamus wouldn't necessarily match those that the cortex is attending to. So in order, again, to consciously attend to a stimulus, you need the cortex. So let's say we're having lunch one day and there's a red and white checkered tablecloth and we have this argument. And then the next day I see somebody coming down the street and I say, I have this gut feeling about this guy. He's an SOB. I don't like him. And maybe what's going on there is he's got a red and white checkered necktie on. Consciously, I'm saying it's my gut feeling because I don't like the way he looks. But what's happened is that the necktie has triggered the activation of the amygdala through the thalamus, the so-called low road, triggered a fear response in me, which I now consciously interpret as this gut feeling about not liking the guy. But in fact, it's being triggered by external stimuli that I'm not processing consciously. So this is important because a lot of people have fears and phobias and anxieties about things they don't understand. They don't know why they're afraid or anxious on a particular time. And it may be through various kinds of experiences the low road gets potentiated in a way that it's activating fears and phobias outside of conscious awareness. And that doesn't make sense in terms of what the conscious brain is looking at in the world or hearing in the world because they've been separately parsed out. So the subcortical pathway, we've been able to time all this very precisely in the rat brain. And it takes, in order for a sound to get to the amygdala from the subcortical pathway, it takes about 10 or 12 milliseconds. So you take a second divided into 1,000 parts, and after 12 of those little parts, the amygdala is already getting the sound. Consciously, for you to be consciously aware of a stimulus, it takes 250, 300 milliseconds. So the amygdala is being triggered much, much faster than consciousness is processing. So the brain ticks in milliseconds. The neurons process information on the level of milliseconds. but the mind is processing things on the order of seconds and half seconds. So if you have a fear response that's being triggered very rapidly like that, consciously you're going to be interpreting what's going on, but it's not going to necessarily match what's really going on.